Well, how a person enters says a lot about the person. This is why we say that first impressions are important, why first words matter. We tend to like grand, elaborate, and memorable entrances. So celebrities will emerge from this black luxury car, they'll step onto this bright red carpet with cameras flashing all about. Performers will enter from behind this closed curtain to the bright lights and the audience's applause. Football teams will run onto the field through this fog with this hype music to get the whole stadium in an uproar, excited for the game that's about to begin. And of course, we all know that moment that everyone waits for at a wedding when the doors open and the beautiful bride, dressed in white, enters into the room. The way that God entered our humanity said a lot about him. The Apostle John wrote that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God took on flesh in the person of Jesus, and Christmas is when we celebrate God's entrance into humanity. It's not the first impression that we probably expected the creator of the universe to have, but it reveals something about who God is. It reveals something about who God is and something about what our relationship with Him looks like. So if you want to open a Bible or open your Bible app, we're going to be in the first 7 verses of Luke chapter 2. We've been in this series leading up to the birth of Jesus called Family Tree. We spent a lot of time looking in both Matthew and Luke's Gospels to examine more closely the family tree or the lineage of Jesus. And what we've seen is that Jesus' family tree is far from the perfect family. His ancestors were known for their flaws and for their mistakes. His family was as much in need of saving as any other family, including our own families. Because Jesus didn't just come for families like ours, but He came from families like ours. And this means that He can empathize with us in our weakness, that He can show us His emotional and physical wounds, that He can understand our grief. And on that first Christmas, God's people had been waiting for salvation for centuries. Like they had been treated as slaves in Egypt. They had lived as exiles in Babylon. They had been disappointed by wicked king after wicked king who failed them. They had been victims of and perpetrators of abuse. They cried out for help and they had looked up for hope. This family had been waiting for this Messiah king to make things right. And generation after generation after generation had come and gone, but this Messiah king was nowhere to be seen. Hope faded. The light at the end of the tunnel grew dim. They wonder if God would ever intervene and save them. And the main purpose of Matthew's gospel is to show us that Jesus is this Messiah King, that He is God with us, that He will save His people from their sins, that He will be the one to make things right. But look at how Matthew describes the birth of Jesus. This was what Jason preached on last week. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him, because the angel appeared to Joseph and said, "Don't be afraid to take Mary home to be your wife, because what's conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit." And so Joseph took Mary home as his wife. But he didn't consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son. And he gave him the name Jesus. I don't know if you've ever noticed it before, but that's it. 6 words. Like all this anticipation has been built up for centuries about this Messiah King who would come and who would save the people, who would restore creation, that relationship with God. And like all this anticipation, and Matthew uses 6 words. She gave birth to a son to describe this turning point in history. I mean, with so much depending on the birth of the Messiah King, I'm a little disappointed that Matthew writes so few words about the birth of Jesus. Like, what were his first words? How old was he when that happened? And we just fast forward after this to the scene when the wise men come and they give gifts to Jesus. I mean, the birth of Jesus feels a little underwhelming at this point. It's not really the entrance that we expect. Well, fortunately, Luke provides more details of these events leading up to the birth of Jesus, and then the moments following his birth. Now, I don't know if it's Luke provides more details because he's a detail-oriented person like me, or if it's because he's a physician, and when you're a physician and dealing with people's health, the details matter. But regardless, the details that Luke provides have become the most common story that we turn to when we retell the Christmas story. And you may be familiar with these words. In Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, this is how the story continues. In those days, Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. So we're given this idea of what time this took place. Everyone went to their own town to register. So the first thing that Luke does is to remind us of that at this time, God's people were under Roman rule, that they were living in the Roman world under the Roman emperor. And in the same way that the Israelites were living under the rule of the Pharaoh in Egypt as slaves, there's still the same connection to that story of the past before they were exited from Egypt, before they were rescued, before they were saved, because the Israelites were still living under the rule of another king. They were looking and expecting their own king to come and to save them and to rule and to reign. But that king hadn't come, and they weren't their own people, but they were living under the Roman rule. Now, the census probably sought to produce a registration list for taxes because the Roman government was like our government. They liked taxes a lot. And so the reason they liked taxes is because it was one of the ways that they would finance their many building projects. So when you think about the Roman Empire, you think about aqueducts, right? You think about Roman roads. And taxes allowed for those things to be constructed. But to the Jews, this tax was just this painful reminder, this continual nagging that they were not their own people, that they were under the authority of the Roman emperor and the Roman government. They needed rescue. Now, Caesar Augustus issued this decree. He issued this decree not from Jerusalem, but from 1,400 miles away across the Mediterranean Sea and the city of Rome. That's a long way away. But it's a decree, it's a census that affects the entire Roman world and even affects Joseph and Mary, who go to Joseph's hometown to register. And so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth, where they were living in Galilee, to Judea, which is another region, to the town of Bethlehem, which was the town that David himself, King David, was born and raised in, where David shepherded sheep, because Joseph belonged to the house and line of David. He was a part of that lineage, that family tree. And he went there to Bethlehem to register with Mary. Now, you can't find two people more opposite than Caesar Augustus and Joseph. I mean, Caesar is powerful and Joseph is powerless. Caesar's rich. Joseph was poor. Caesar was known around the world. Joseph was known just among his family and friends. I mean, Caesar lived in Rome, the capital of the entire world, and Joseph lived in the small Galilean town of Nazareth. And yet, even at the beginning of the story, we see that Caesar and Joseph both bring about God's purpose to save the world. What Caesar thinks is a good idea to strengthen his own empire and his power over the entire world, God uses to move Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, the town of David, which is where Jesus is going to be born. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Roman emperor, if you're Joseph, a poor carpenter from the town of Nazareth, God is sovereign over all and uses all sorts of different kinds of people to weave together the tapestry of our redemption. This is why Matthew references a prophecy like Micah 5:2, which actually talks about Bethlehem being the place in which this Messiah King would be born, in which the Messiah King would enter into the world. This prophecy in Micah 5:2, which is quoted in Matthew 2:6, says, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah." Like, you're discounted, you're dismissed, you're not thought of having any sort of value, but Bethlehem, even like Jericho, or even like Jerusalem, or even like Rome, is used for God's purpose. You're by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Joseph's lineage as a descendant of David is what brings Jesus into the family tree of David. It's what fulfills these prophecies about a future king being raised up to sit on the throne of David as shepherd, ruler over God's people. And even though people didn't consider Bethlehem worthy of recognition, God's plan was to use the very places and people that the world dismisses to accomplish his purpose. And so, Joseph went there with Mary to register, and Mary was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. Mary didn't need to go to Bethlehem with Joseph. She didn't need to be present at the census. It would have been enough for Joseph just to go by himself as the representative, the head of their family. But when Joseph goes to Bethlehem, he goes there with Mary. He takes Mary with her. But here's the problem. The time comes for the baby to be born. Like the time came for Mary to give birth while they were in Bethlehem, not while they were at home in Nazareth, surrounded by their friends and their family, like the people that they knew best, the people that they would want to be present to celebrate this wonderful occasion, this entrance of new life into the world. And so I'm left to wonder, was this poor planning on their part? I mean, did they miss an important pregnancy and birthing class that would help them know when to predict the due date? Did they make a miscalculation? Like, what's going on that the time came for the baby to be born while they were away, while they were traveling, while they were on a business trip?
Seriously?
I mean, if Elizabeth knew that she was 6 months pregnant when Mary had visited her, then surely Mary knew that she was nearing her due date. And it wasn't like this journey took longer than they expected, where they could go to Bethlehem and then they could return to Nazareth in time for the baby to be born, because this journey probably only took about 3 days to complete. And Joseph had relatives in Bethlehem, that's why he goes there. So he'd probably been there before, and he probably knew how long the journey would take. And so I doubt it's just a miscalculation. I mean, even if they got stuck behind a slow camel or a backed-up caravan, this wouldn't have delayed them too much. And so I wonder if Joseph and Mary may have planned to stay in Bethlehem. Like, they went there for the census, yes, but perhaps back in Nazareth with the scandal surrounding Mary not being wedded to Joseph and yet conceiving a son, if that scandal would have caused shame, would have caused fear and separation and isolation to where they journeyed to Bethlehem for the census, yes, but perhaps they planned on staying in order to avoid the pain and the isolation that they had back in Nazareth. I mean, after Jesus is born, Joseph and Mary actually we're told they're in Bethlehem, because when the Magi come, months later, where do they go and visit Jesus? They don't go to Nazareth, they go to Bethlehem. And so it wasn't like they went for the census, they gave birth, and they went home to Nazareth. They stayed in Bethlehem because that's where the Magi visited them. It's only after they returned from Egypt, where they retreated to avoid Herod's massacre, that they moved back to Nazareth in Galilee. And so I wonder if Joseph and Mary wanted a fresh start in Bethlehem. And perhaps their journey to Bethlehem was poor timing, but perhaps they were actually considering staying. Even still, I'm left to consider Mary's emotions. I'm not talking about her emotions because she's pregnant and the hormones and all that sort of stuff. But I'm thinking about Mary's emotions as it relates to her family that she left behind in Nazareth, right? She's from Nazareth. And they wouldn't have traveled 70 miles to Bethlehem to be present for this birth. And even so, if the time came for the baby to be born, maybe it was a little sooner than they thought. There wouldn't have been time for a messenger to get back to Nazareth over 3 days, and then for the family to pack up and travel another 3 days. Like, you typically don't have 6 days to prepare when you know that the baby's coming. And so there's no hospitals, there's no emergency rooms, there's no birthing centers. And so when a mother gave birth, especially for the first time, guess who she relied on? Her family and her friends to support her and to assist her. But Mary's got no one, or at least anyone that she knows well. I mean, she's with Joseph, but Joseph's a carpenter, not a doctor. And if there were other people present, it probably would have been Joseph's relatives, Mary's in-laws, and we all know how that may have felt. She was only a teenager, and she had never done this before. And even if nothing went wrong and both the baby and the mother were healthy, she would want those close with her to celebrate, right? But no one's there. They're 70 miles away from all the people that they knew, the place that was familiar to them. And we're told after the time came for the baby to be born, she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. I don't know if you knew that more than 10,000 babies are born each day in America. 10,000 babies every day in America. Now, I know that those statistics fluctuate each year, right, with each generation. Those would have been different 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born. It would have been different even just in Jewish culture in general. But the point is that births, like today and back then, are not unusual. They happened every day. And the fact that a baby was being born in the small town of Bethlehem wouldn't be a surprise. And so we read the story and things are happening as expected, right? Time came for the baby to be born and she gave birth to a firstborn, a son. But Luke doesn't stop there. He provides another detail. He says that she wrapped him in cloths. These cloths would have been wrapped around the baby's arms and legs to keep the limbs covered and protected, right? You don't want a baby to have the freedom to flail about and potentially fall or roll over wrong. And so they would wrap the babies in these cloths. It was a common practice. It was totally normal. And so as we continue to read the story, the baby was born in Bethlehem. The baby was a son. She wrapped him in cloths. Everything's going as much as we expect. It's simple. It's straightforward. And yet, the fact that we're given this detail, that she wrapped him in cloths, points to something unique about this birth. Like usually, births in the Bible are described very briefly. Simply, she gave birth to a son, like what Matthew says. Or, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, was the father of so-and-so, was the father of so-and-so. Like we talked about these genealogies. And so the fact that we're even given this detail that this baby was not just born, but was wrapped in cloths, even though that was common, shows us that Luke's trying to communicate something important about who this baby is by showing us how he entered into the world. And so then Luke adds one more detail to reinforce the uniqueness of this birth. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. If Joseph and Mary were still in Nazareth, Joseph may have built, a little small wooden crib for Jesus. I mean, he was a carpenter after all, right? But they're away from home, and so they have to settle for a manger or this wooden feeding trough that was used to feed animals. This, unlike wrapping the baby in cloths, was an unusual practice. It wasn't like every baby that was born was wrapped in cloths and placed in a manger. And when you read this, you would immediately think something different is happening here. There is something about how this baby is entering the world that we are supposed to notice. I mean, part of me thinks that, God could enable Mary to give birth as a virgin, that he could have provided a more suitable place, a more suitable setting for Jesus to enter into the world, right? I mean, why was the Messiah King placed in this feeding trough meant for animals? Like, why did God choose this specific place and this specific time? Why not earlier when they were still in Nazareth? Why not later when maybe they returned to Nazareth? Why not Jerusalem? Why not some place that royalty is connected with? Well, Luke includes one more phrase, almost as if he's thinking of these questions in his head, and he's trying to justify why he highlights that Jesus was placed in a manger. He's trying to explain what everyone's thinking, and you guys probably know what that next phrase is. She placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. And it's that phrase that actually creates more confusion, I think, for people than clarity. Like, what does Luke mean by no guest room available? Well, some people think that what Luke was saying is that because there was no guest room or inn, that Jesus was born in maybe a cave or in a stable that was detached from the house. Or maybe Jesus was born in this public camp, because travelers would come through Bethlehem and they would stay the night in this public camp, sort of this open air environment. Maybe you'd have some tents up or some temporary structures. And so maybe Jesus was placed in a feeding trough that was used to feed the camels that travelers would go with, or a donkey or a horse or whatever it might have been. But I don't think that that's probably very likely, because Joseph and Mary weren't like other travelers, were they? Their destination was Bethlehem. And so they wouldn't stay in an overnight dwelling if they were planning on staying in Bethlehem, as we talked about, right? They didn't just come to Bethlehem, do the census, give birth, return home. They planned on staying, and so they would need some more permanent place to stay. This isn't really the guest room of an inn or hotel either, because Bethlehem is a small town. It's a Jewish town, and inns were Roman industry. Bethlehem was only 5 miles from the much larger city of Jerusalem, and so it would probably make sense that if you're traveling to Jerusalem, you would just walk the extra 5 miles and stay the night at your destination rather than stopping in Bethlehem only to have, maybe another hour walk to Jerusalem the next day. And so they would probably walk the extra 5 miles rather than stay in Bethlehem. But the exception, of course, was if these travelers had family in Bethlehem. Mark Moore explains that Jews relied on hospitality from their extended family. And he says that the good folks in Bethlehem would never have allowed one of their own people to be turned out, especially during childbirth. And the Jews would even invite complete strangers to stay with them. So even if Mary and Joseph were someone unfamiliar, it's very likely that the Jewish people there in the Jewish small town of Bethlehem would have demonstrated small town hospitality and welcomed them into their home. And so when we read that there's no guest room available for them, probably what's being described is an upper level of a Jewish home. There was an upper guest room, much like the upper room that Jesus and his disciples shared at Last Supper in. But this guest room would have been full with all the other travelers who would also come to Bethlehem for the census, because that's where their roots were. And so Mary and Joseph may have showed up too late. There wasn't any room upstairs for them in the guest room, and so they would have stayed downstairs. And you know who else lived downstairs? The animals. Not during the day, but at night they would bring the animals inside in order to protect them. Now, I'm not talking about the family dog, because we all know the family dog would have been, sleeping with the parents on the bed in their bedroom, right? I'm not talking about the family cat either, because cats are the pets of pagans, and so there's not many cats in those households. So the animals would have been staying in the living quarters downstairs, and they would keep a feeding trough for the animals to eat during the night next to the front door of the home. And so I think this reconstruction makes sense, where Joseph and Mary, they show up, there's no guest room available upstairs, and so they're given a place to stay that's not comfortable, but it's suitable, and they stay with the animals, and when Jesus is born, they place Jesus in this feeding trough after wrapping him in these cloths. There's no reason to think that Joseph's relatives would have shunned Joseph and Mary like maybe their family and friends in Nazareth, because all these people in Bethlehem knew 70 miles away is they got married and they got pregnant. There wasn't any scandal involved, and so they would show hospitality to Joseph and to Mary. Now, whether we read about the birth of Jesus in Luke with even just these few verses that are used to describe his entrance into the world, or the much shorter 6-word version in Matthew that she gave birth to a son, we can see the same message on that first Christmas. And I think it's what both Matthew and Luke are trying to communicate. That the birth of Jesus was simple. That the birth of Jesus was simple. It was common. It was ordinary. It made do with what they had. The word simple is used to describe being free from vanity, from excess, from guile, where the person is simple in that they're innocent and they're humble. Simple is a word that's used to describe ordinary. It's everyday, it's commonplace. There's no hidden meaning. Simple is approachable and it's relatable. Simple is something like a crock-pot dinner. Simple is a used car. It's a small town in Indiana. Simple is a man's word or a handshake to seal the deal. Simple is watching a warm fire at night. It's reading a good book with a soft blanket. It's as simple as a baby's laugh. It's a dad joke. It's one lamp lighting a dark room. It's drawing a sketch. It's gazing at a sunset. It's wearing the same jacket until it rips. Simple is feeding animals every morning. Simple is holding a baby in your arms and not being able to look away from that cute little face. And I think what we see in the Christmas story is that the entrance of the Messiah King was simple. I mean, simple is what carpentry as a profession. Simple is this teenage girl with this pure heart who says to the Lord, "Your word be fulfilled." Simple is this small town in Judea. Simple is traveling 70 miles on foot. It's a dirty delivery room among the in-laws. It's one piece of cloth to wrap a baby. Simple is a feeding trough for a crib. It's resting your head on your husband's shoulder after giving birth. Even the sign that God gave to the shepherds represented this simplicity. "This will be a sign to you," the angels told the shepherds. "You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." That's it. That's the sign that God has entered into humanity, the sign that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us is what? That you're going to find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's ordinary, but it's also approachable and it's relatable. It's not intimidating. A baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger is something that the shepherds would be able to relate to because they were with animals day and night. They were simple, ordinary people who were invited to see the birth of the Messiah King. And so I think that everything in the story points to its simplicity. But although the entrance of Jesus was simple, it still was significant. Because that's why Mary treasured up all these things and she pondered them in her heart. I don't think that Mary was disappointed with their first Christmas as a family. I mean, yeah, it may not have been what she expected. Yeah, it may have been staying in the living quarters of the house of Joseph's family, her in-laws. Yes, she may have had to settle for placing Jesus in a manger rather than having a comfortable bed to lay and rest with him. It may have been simple, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. She treasured up these things and she pondered them in her heart. She saw the significance in its simplicity. I think that most of us want simplicity, right? I mean, ironically, Christmas has become anything but simple. It's complex and it's complicated at times. We begin preparing for Christmas months in advance. We make these long lists of tech tools and toys we do not need. We spend money to buy gifts and to decorate our homes. We spend time to watch Hallmark movies that really only remind us of how imperfect our life is. We spend emotional energy to pack our schedule so we can rush to see family, friends, and relatives. The Christmas season isn't always simple. It can actually be complex and complicated. Don't get me wrong, though. I love Christmas. I love the Christmas season. I love the hot drinks and the cold weather. I love the lights hung around town. I love some Christmas music. I love the extra effort that Kayla makes to decorate our home, to bake sweets, to wrap gifts. I love seeing family. I love receiving gifts. I like giving gifts, maybe not as much, but we're not perfect. If it isn't the most wonderful time of the year, then it's sure at the top of the list, right? You guys can probably agree with that, right? It's definitely at the top of the list. But as we approach the new year, perhaps what the birth of Jesus is meant to communicate to us is that we need to reshape our priorities around simplicity. I mean, Jesus' entrance said a lot about who he is and what a relationship with him looks like. He was humble. He was honest. He was selfless. He was simple. He focused on knowing God and doing the will of God. He had simple priorities. He wasn't looking to impress people. He was looking to please his Heavenly Father. And because of these things, Jesus was relatable and Jesus was approachable. See, in the Christmas story, God didn't come like Caesar Augustus. He became like Joseph and Mary. He didn't take on the nature of a ruler, but he took on the nature of a servant. He didn't choose a throne room for his grand entrance, but he chose an everyday home on an ordinary day. This wasn't a disguise, there wasn't hidden meaning behind it, but his sincerity was revealed in the simplicity of his entrance. See, if God is humble enough to enter humanity, wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger, then your heart is ready enough for him to enter it. You don't need to have everything together. You don't need to polish your resume. You don't need to put on flashing lights and hype music. You don't need to wear your best suit or your fanciest dress. You simply come to Jesus as you are. because the setting that God enters into the world is one that is simple. And that's what God asks of us, is to come to him simply so that he can enter in just as we are. 30 years later, this time in the upstairs room of this home in Judea, Jesus has this meal with his disciples. And during that meal, he gives us two symbols that remind us of who he is and what a relationship with him looks like. These symbols are much like the manger and much like the cloths. They're simple. It's unleavened bread, and it's a cup of wine. And if you think about unleavened bread and a cup of wine, those were everyday staples in their diet. Like those were foods, and that was a drink that was very common. It was something that was easy to come by, that was affordable. It was approachable, it was relatable, it was ordinary, it was straightforward, it was accessible for them. But even though those symbols of unleavened bread and a cup of wine are simple, ordinary, everyday, it doesn't mean that they're not significant, that they're not meaningful. The unleavened bread and the wine represent Jesus' body and his blood that were broken and were poured out for us on the cross. Because through Jesus' death and his resurrection, we receive access to our Father in heaven. That our relationship with God is reconciled. That we don't have to clean up our act, but we can depend on the power of God on the cross to pay the debt that we owe and to reconcile an unreconcilable relationship, at least what we can do. It's by his grace and by his mercy that he comes to us and he redeems and he saves us. The symbols that we use today are the same. It's unleavened bread, it's a cup of juice. Those are common, everyday staples, things that we might have even in our homes every single day. And yet, just because they're simple and they're ordinary and they're relatable, doesn't mean that they're not meaningful. We're reminded when we hold them of God's love for us in Jesus. We're comforted by God's desire to be in relationship with us. We're humbled by the humility of Jesus, who not only became like us by being placed in a wooden manger, but he also died for us by being crucified on a wooden cross. And so my prayer for us is that we don't let these simple elements that we share each week lose their significance. Because every day, every breath is a gift from God. And so today, as we prepare to exchange and unwrap gifts with family and friends around Christmas, let us thank God our Father for the gift of salvation through Jesus, our Messiah. So the servers are going to come and they're going to pass the juice and the unleavened bread. If you're a follower of Jesus, then we invite you to take one of each, to pray for a moment, and then to share in that whenever you're ready. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you loved us so much that you sent your Son, the Word, to take on our humanity, to take on flesh, to take on our emotions and our weaknesses, to become like us so that we could become like you one day through your death and through your resurrection. Jesus, thank you for surrendering to the will of our Father by saying, not my will, but your will be done. Even though it was painful, even though it was shameful, even though it isolated you, you endured the cross, despising its shame, so that you could be seated at the right hand of the Father, so that we may one day too, as co-heirs, be seated at the right hand of the Father with you. We would be able to live and enjoy eternal life, life without end, true life, without sin, without pain, without suffering. Father, as we hold the bread, as we hold the juice, Lord, help that simple message of Christmas, that simple message of your coming to us, becoming like us in every way, even as you entered into this world, to cause us to breathe slowly, to exhale deeply, and to rest in the simple truth that we are sons and daughters of our Creator, of our Father. Jesus, thank you for your love and entering into this world to save us. We pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen.